November 12, 1942. Richmond, California. A complete cargo vessel, 441 feet long, weighing over 14,000 tons, stood ready to slide into San Francisco Bay. The ship had been assembled in just 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes. In traditional shipyards, master builders had spent 6 to 8 months constructing vessels of similar size since before the American Revolution. Yet here, a complete Liberty ship stood ready for service. The crowd gathering that morning included officials from the Maritime Commission, journalists from newspapers across America, and, most notably, owners and engineers from competing shipyards who had traveled from the East Coast to witness what they still believed might be an elaborate fraud. They walked slowly around the hull of the SS Robert E. Peary, examining welds, inspecting plates, searching for evidence of the shortcuts they were certain must exist. Over 1,000 workers stepped back from the vessel they had built. Not traditional shipwrights. Not experienced maritime craftsmen. Former secretaries, farmers, housewives, and laborers who had learned welding techniques just weeks earlier. They stood in work clothes still stained with metal dust and paint, watching the officials inspect their work with barely concealed skepticism. The mathematics of Allied victory were being written not in battle strategies, but in production statistics that would shatter every assumption maritime experts carried about shipbuilding limits, construction time frames, and industrial possibility. The transformation had begun nearly 2 years earlier, on December 27, 1940, when Henry J. Kaiser signed his first shipbuilding contract. A man who had never built a ship, never managed a shipyard, never worked a day in maritime industry. He had spent his career moving earth and pouring concrete for massive dam projects across the American West, Hoover Dam, Grand Coulee, Bonneville. Yet here stood a 58-year-old construction magnate who had just promised the United States Maritime Commission he would build 30 cargo vessels for the British government within 2 years. Traditional shipbuilders dismissed him immediately. The very idea was offensive. Shipbuilding was a craft passed down through generations, refined over centuries, requiring knowledge that couldn't simply be learned from textbooks or acquired through brash confidence. The Todd Bath Iron Works, one of America's oldest shipyards, had reluctantly agreed to partner with Kaiser on the project, assuming their expertise would compensate for his ignorance. What none of them understood was that Kaiser's lack of shipbuilding experience would become his greatest advantage. Among those watching Kaiser's early efforts was William Francis Gibbs, America's most respected naval architect. His firm, Gibbs & Cox, had created the Liberty ship plans based on British designs. He had designed more ships than Kaiser had probably seen. When told Kaiser planned to build ships using assembly line methods, Gibbs's response was immediate and cutting. Ships are not automobiles. You cannot bolt them together from standardized parts. The sea will find every weakness, every shortcut, every compromise. And men will die because of it. The dismissal was rooted in 3 centuries of shipbuilding tradition. Since the age of sail, vessels had been constructed by master craftsmen who understood wood, then steel, through years of apprenticeship. Each ship was essentially unique, custom-fitted by skilled workers who shaped every plate, adjusted every joint, ensured every seal through accumulated knowledge and trained intuition. The idea that housewives and farmers could build seaworthy vessels in weeks was not just impractical, it was dangerous. Kaiser heard the criticism and ignored it completely. His chief engineer, Clay Bedford, had visited a Ford Motor Company assembly line in Detroit just weeks before. Bedford returned with notebooks filled with observations about how Ford assembled thousands of complex machines using workers who performed simple, repetitive tasks. The workers didn't need to understand the entire automobile. They needed to master one specific operation which they would repeat hundreds of times. In the planning offices of Todd Shipyards in New York, Kaiser and Bedford examined traditional shipbuilding procedures. They found an industry that had barely changed in 100 years. Ships were still built sequentially from keel to deck, with each stage waiting for the previous stage to complete. Skilled workers moved between multiple ships, performing custom work that required constant decision-making and adjustment. Kaiser saw immediately that conventional methods would never meet wartime demands. The British were losing ships faster than they could replace them. U-boats were sinking merchant vessels at a rate that threatened to starve Britain into surrender. The mathematics were brutal. Germany needed to sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping monthly to win the war through blockade. They were already approaching that figure. How long to build a ship the traditional way? Kaiser asked Todd's senior engineer during their first meeting. 6 to 8 months. Perhaps slightly faster with a dedicated workforce. How many ships can you build simultaneously? 4, perhaps 6 if we expand facilities. But the real limitation is skilled labor. You cannot simply hire workers off the street to build ships. Kaiser looked at Bedford. Why not? The first workers arrived at Richmond in August 1941, 8 months after construction began on the shipyard itself. Kaiser had built the facility in record time, 240 days to transform mudflats into an industrial complex with 7 building ways, the necessary cranes, power supplies and support infrastructure. The workers were not who traditional shipyards would have hired. They came from farms across the Midwest, factories in the East, households throughout California. Many were women. Significant numbers were African American. Very few had ever seen the ocean. Almost none had experience with maritime construction. Charles Todd, the traditional shipbuilder partnering with Kaiser, walked through the Richmond yard in October 1941. His confidential letter to his board of directors captured his alarm. Kaiser has assembled what appears to be an army rather than a workforce. The people lack fundamental understanding of naval architecture, maritime tradition, and the subtle complexities that distinguish adequate construction from seaworthy vessels. His training program teaches welding in 2 weeks. Our apprentice programs require 4 years. I fear we have partnered with catastrophe. Kaiser's training program was indeed revolutionary, but not in the way Todd feared. Traditional welding apprenticeships taught comprehensive skills, how to weld in every position, on every material, for every application. Kaiser's instructors taught specific techniques for specific tasks. Workers didn't need to know how to weld everything. They needed to master vertical seams on bulkheads, or horizontal deck plates, or curved hull sections. One task, repeated hundreds of times until it became automatic. The simplification extended throughout the construction process. Kaiser's engineers broke down ship assembly into hundreds of individual operations, each simple enough to be learned quickly and performed reliably. Instead of custom-fitting plates on the ship itself, workers fabricated entire sections in assembly buildings, where jigs and fixtures ensured consistency. These prefabricated sections, some weighing over 30 tons, were then lifted by crane and welded into place on the hull. The approach violated every principle of traditional shipbuilding. Master craftsmen prided themselves on the subtle adjustments that ensured perfect fit. Kaiser's system eliminated adjustment. Sections were built to exact specifications in controlled conditions, then assembled like building blocks. When William Francis Gibbs inspected Richmond Shipyard in January 1942, his report acknowledged grudging recognition of Kaiser's engineering, even as it maintained professional skepticism. The prefabrication is competent. The welding appears adequate under inspection, though long-term seaworthiness remains uncertain. The organization of workflow demonstrates industrial efficiency. But ships are not manufactured products. They face stresses that automobiles and bridges never encounter. A welded seam that appears sound in harbor may fail catastrophically in North Atlantic storms. Traditional riveted construction has proven reliable across centuries. Kaiser's welded ships have proven nothing yet. The first test came in April 1942. The SS Patrick Henry, Kaiser's first completed Liberty ship, departed San Francisco for Australia carrying military cargo. The vessel encountered heavy weather crossing the Pacific. Traditional shipbuilders waited for reports of structural failure. The ship arrived safely, departed again, made multiple Pacific crossings. Other Kaiser-built ships followed, entering the most dangerous waters of the war, the North Atlantic convoy routes where U-boats hunted and winter storms tested every vessel. The ships survived. Not just survived, performed. By summer 1942, dozens of Kaiser-built Liberty ships were operating globally. Loss rates to enemy action were comparable to traditionally built vessels. Structural failures were rare. The welding held. But the real revolution wasn't in the ships themselves. It was in the construction time. Kaiser's first Liberty ship took 197 days to build. The second required 169 days. The fifth required 128 days. By spring 1942, Richmond was completing Liberty ships in 70 days on average. Traditional shipbuilders watched these figures with increasing alarm. What Kaiser had achieved wasn't just faster construction. He had shattered fundamental assumptions about what shipbuilding required. The craft knowledge, the generational expertise, the subtle skills that maritime communities had cultivated for centuries. Kaiser had replaced all of it with training programs, standardized procedures, and workers who had never seen the ocean. In May 1942, Kaiser announced his next target. He would build a Liberty ship in under 30 days. The maritime industry's response was swift. The American Bureau of Shipping, which certified vessels as seaworthy, stated publicly that accelerated construction risked compromising structural integrity. The Marine Engineers Beneficial Association, representing traditional maritime workers, condemned Kaiser's approach as dangerous cost-cutting that prioritized speed over safety. Kaiser's response was characteristic. On June 19, 1942, he invited journalists, officials, and competing shipyard owners to witness an attempt at record-breaking construction. They gathered at Richmond Shipyard No. 2 to watch the keel laying of a Liberty ship that would be named the Joseph N. Teal. The keel touched down at 12:01 a.m. Workers swarmed the building ways, welding prefabricated sections into place with choreographed precision. Witnesses watched around the clock as the hull took shape with astonishing speed. 10 days. 14 days. 20 days. The ship emerged from an organized chaos of welding sparks, crane movements, and thousands of workers executing rehearsed operations. 24 days after the keel laying, the Joseph N. Teal slid into San Francisco Bay as a complete, functional vessel. The crowd that had gathered to witness Kaiser's failure instead watched the impossible become routine. It would not remain the record for long. The Robert E. Peary was laid down on November 8, 1942. Kaiser had announced in advance that this ship would set a new record, not to demonstrate what was possible but to prove what would soon become standard. This would not be a publicity stunt. Every procedure used would be immediately implemented across all Kaiser yards. Traditional shipbuilders dismissed the attempt before it began. A letter from the president of New York Shipbuilding Corporation, one of America's oldest yards, expressed the industry consensus. Kaiser's publicity theatrics distract from serious wartime production. Building a ship in days rather than weeks proves nothing except that corners have been cut. The vessel will either fail at sea or require extensive refitting before it becomes truly seaworthy. Responsible shipbuilders focus on quality, not headlines. The first prefabricated sections arrived at the building way before the keel touched down. Kaiser's planning had reached extraordinary precision. Every plate, beam, bulkhead, and fitting had been fabricated in assembly halls during the previous 2 weeks. The entire ship existed as hundreds of components, each marked, measured, and ready for installation. The keel laying wasn't the start of construction. It was the start of final assembly. Over 1,500 workers participated, divided into specialized teams. Welders worked in groups of 6, each welder handling a specific type of seam. Crane operators positioned sections with practiced precision. Electricians and plumbers installed systems as hull plates were still being welded. Multiple operations proceeded simultaneously, each team executing its role without interfering with others. The pace was extraordinary. Sections weighing 30 tons swung through the air every 20 minutes, positioned by crane operators who had learned their craft in Kaiser's training program just months earlier. Welders who had been housewives and teachers worked alongside farmers and factory workers, each performing the specific task they had trained for, repeated hundreds of times before on previous ships. Traditional shipbuilding had always been sequential. Complete the hull, then install decks, then add superstructure, then install machinery. Kaiser's approach was parallel. The propulsion system was being installed while upper decks were still being welded. Cargo holds were being painted while masts were being fitted. Electrical systems were being tested while the stern was still open. By the end of the first day, the ship's basic hull structure was visible. By the end of the second day, decks were in place and the superstructure was rising. On the third day, the propulsion system was being tested while finishing work continued on living spaces. By the fourth day, the vessel was recognizable as a complete ship. On November 12, 4 days and 15 hours after the keel touched down, the Robert E. Peary was complete. Not partially finished. Not awaiting final fitting. Complete. Ready for sea trials, which it would pass without requiring any additional work. The crowd that had gathered to witness this moment included officials who had spent decades in maritime industry, engineers who had designed dozens of ships, and competitors who had dismissed Kaiser as an ignorant opportunist. They examined the vessel in silence, measuring welds, checking installations, searching for the shortcuts that must exist somewhere. They found nothing. The ship met every specification. The welds were sound. The systems functioned. The vessel was seaworthy. Commander Joseph Kenworthy of the Royal Navy, assigned to the British Admiralty delegation in Washington, attended the launch. His official report captured the profound implications of what he had witnessed. I have observed a transformation in industrial production that exceeds in significance most military victories. The Americans are building merchant shipping at a rate that exceeds the combined capacity of the rest of the world. Kaiser alone produces more tonnage monthly than the entire British shipbuilding industry. The approaches are crude by Admiralty standards. The ships are inelegant. But they float. They carry cargo. And there are thousands of them. The record-breaking ship was not an anomaly. By December 1942, Kaiser's yards were routinely completing Liberty ships in 30 to 40 days. The Richmond facility alone was launching one ship every 3 days. Across all 7 Kaiser yards, production reached levels that seemed impossible by pre-war standards. 3 ships per week, 12 ships per month. By the end of 1942, Kaiser had delivered over 200 Liberty ships. The entire American shipbuilding industry had built fewer than that during all of 1940. The true revolution was not in the ships but in the people building them. By mid-1943, Kaiser's 7 shipyards employed nearly 200,000 workers. More than a quarter were women. Tens of thousands were African American. The workforce represented a demographic transformation as significant as the industrial transformation. Margaret Wilson had been a secretary in Portland, Oregon. In April 1942, she saw Kaiser's advertisement offering welding training and wages 20% higher than clerical work. The training program lasted 2 weeks. By May, she was working on Liberty ship hulls, welding vertical seams on bulkheads. By August, she was training new workers. I had never considered industrial work, she wrote in a letter to her sister in Iowa. But there's something remarkable about what we're doing. Yesterday I welded a section that will form part of a cargo hold. Next month, that ship will carry supplies to soldiers overseas. I can see the direct connection between my work and their survival. It's the most meaningful thing I've ever done. The democratization of skilled work that Kaiser enabled challenged fundamental assumptions about labor, skill, and capability. Traditional shipyards had maintained that complex construction required generational expertise, accumulated knowledge that couldn't be taught quickly. Kaiser proved that complex construction could be broken into simple, repeatable operations that could be mastered in weeks. The implications extended far beyond shipbuilding. If ships could be built by rapidly trained workers, what else might be possible? How many industries had maintained artificial barriers to entry, claiming complexity where systematic simplification might suffice? Joseph James had been a sharecropper in Mississippi. In early 1942, he traveled to Richmond after hearing about Kaiser's wages and training opportunities. He completed welding school in 16 days and began working on Liberty ships. By 1943, he was a team leader supervising 12 other welders. Back home, I never would have been allowed to learn a skilled trade, he said in an interview conducted decades later. The shipyard didn't care where I came from or what I looked like. They cared whether I could weld a straight seam. That opportunity changed my entire life. The scale of opportunity Kaiser created was unprecedented. Nearly 200,000 people, many of whom had faced barriers to skilled employment due to gender, race, or lack of formal education, gained access to training, wages, and capabilities they would never have developed through conventional career paths. But the human cost of this transformation was also significant. The work was dangerous. Welding accidents caused burns and eye injuries. Heavy machinery and crane operations resulted in crush injuries and falls. The pace was relentless. Workers typically worked 6 days per week, often 10 hours per day. The pressure to maintain production schedules was constant. Richmond Shipyard recorded approximately 1 injury per 15,000 worker hours during 1943, a rate considered acceptable by wartime standards but significantly higher than modern safety requirements. Over the course of the war, dozens of workers died in industrial accidents at Kaiser's yards. Hundreds more sustained permanent injuries. Yet workers continued arriving. The wages were exceptional. Kaiser paid 20 to 30% above standard industrial rates. The work felt meaningful. Every worker understood that the ships they built would carry supplies, equipment, and food to Allied forces. Each completed vessel represented a direct contribution to the war effort. Kaiser reinforced this sense of purpose deliberately. Shipyard bulletin boards displayed photographs of Liberty ships in combat zones, carrying tanks to North Africa, delivering food to Soviet ports, transporting troops to Pacific islands. Workers saw their labor translated into tangible impact. Christmas 1943 demonstrated Kaiser's approach to workforce management. While traditional shipyards observed the holiday with 1 or 2 days off, Kaiser's facilities maintained production schedules. But rather than simply demanding work, Kaiser's organization provided Christmas celebrations that acknowledged workers' sacrifices. At the Richmond yards, management arranged for Christmas dinner to be served in facility cafeterias. Turkey, ham, and traditional accompaniments provided free to workers on shift. Local churches sent carolers. The Richmond Municipal Band performed. Kaiser himself visited the yards, shaking hands with workers and personally thanking them for their service. The gesture was calculated but effective. Workers felt recognized. Morale remained high. Production continued without interruption. The combination of meaningful work, good wages, and institutional recognition created loyalty that transcended conventional employment relationships. By mid-1944, Kaiser's influence had transformed not just his own yards but the entire American shipbuilding industry. 18 shipyards across the country were building Liberty ships using prefabrication and welding. Average construction time had fallen from 230 days initially to just 42 days. The United States was launching 3 Liberty ships daily, more tonnage than German submarines could sink. The psychological impact on traditional maritime industry was profound. Everything that established shipbuilders believed about their craft had been proven unnecessary. The generational knowledge, the subtle expertise, the careful craftsmanship. Kaiser had replaced it all with training programs and standardized procedures. The president of New York Shipbuilding Corporation visited Richmond in December 1943. His confidential report to his board of directors revealed complete ideological collapse. Kaiser has achieved what our industry considered impossible by refusing to accept our limitations. He treated shipbuilding as a manufacturing problem rather than a craft tradition. He simplified where we sought perfection. He standardized where we customized. He trained masses of unskilled workers where we cultivated generational expertise. The result is ships built in 1/10 the time at 2/3 the cost. We must either adopt his approaches or accept irrelevance. By early 1944, traditional shipyards were implementing Kaiser's methods. Bethlehem Steel, one of America's largest shipbuilders, sent engineers to study Richmond's prefabrication systems. Newport News shipbuilding adopted parallel assembly techniques. Even the most skeptical yards acknowledged that wartime demands required industrial methods rather than craft approaches. But Kaiser's revolution extended beyond construction techniques. The massive employment he created transformed entire communities. The city of Richmond, California, grew from a population of 23,000 in 1940 to over 100,000 by 1943, driven entirely by shipyard employment. Kaiser built Vanport City in Oregon, which briefly became the state's second-largest city with a population exceeding 40,000, all of whom worked in shipyards or supporting industries. These boom towns created social tensions. Rapid population growth strained housing, schools, and infrastructure. The demographic diversity of Kaiser's workforce, with workers from dozens of states, multiple racial backgrounds, and varying cultural traditions, created friction in communities that had been relatively homogeneous. Richmond experienced race riots in 1943 as existing residents clashed with newcomers. Kaiser responded by investing in community infrastructure. He built housing projects, though never enough to meet demand. He established medical clinics to serve workers and their families, partnering with physician Sidney Garfield to create prepaid healthcare programs that would eventually evolve into Kaiser Permanente. He funded schools, recreation centers, and childcare facilities. The social engineering was as ambitious as the industrial engineering. Kaiser was attempting to create not just shipyards but functioning communities capable of supporting massive industrial operations. The experiment was imperfect, often chaotic, but it demonstrated the comprehensive thinking Kaiser applied to complex problems. By the end of 1944, the strategic implications of Kaiser's production achievement were undeniable. Germany had entered the war believing that submarine warfare could starve Britain into surrender by sinking merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced. The calculation was sound based on traditional shipbuilding capacity. But Kaiser had shattered the mathematics. In 1943 alone, American shipyards built over 19 million tons of merchant shipping, more than the entire world's shipbuilding capacity in 1939. Kaiser's 7 yards produced over 1,000 Liberty ships during the war, comprising more than a third of total American wartime merchant construction. German submariners found themselves facing an impossible equation. Even during their most successful periods, U-boats sank approximately 700,000 tons of Allied shipping monthly. But the Americans alone were launching over 1.5 million tons monthly by 1943. For every ship sunk, 2 more entered service. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of Germany's submarine fleet, recognized the strategic implications by mid-1943. In his private diary, later seized and declassified, he wrote with bitter recognition, "The American production achievement has rendered our submarine campaign mathematically futile. We continue sinking Allied vessels at rates that would be catastrophic against traditional replacement capacity. But the Americans build ships faster than we can sink them. The industrial disparity is so vast that tactical excellence cannot compensate." The Liberty ships themselves were not exceptional vessels. They were slow, 11 knots maximum speed. They were basic, minimal accommodations, simple propulsion systems, utilitarian design. They were mass-produced rather than individually crafted. But they worked. They carried 10,000 tons of cargo per voyage. They survived North Atlantic storms and Pacific typhoons. And there were thousands of them. The strategic impact extended beyond simply replacing losses. The massive surge in available shipping enabled operations that would have been impossible with limited merchant capacity. The invasion of North Africa in November 1942 required transporting an entire army across the Atlantic. The D-Day invasion in June 1944 required unprecedented concentration of shipping in English ports. The island-hopping campaign in the Pacific depended on supply lines stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. Every major Allied operation was enabled by merchant shipping that Kaiser and the American shipbuilding industry had provided. Without those Liberty ships, the strategic options available to Allied commanders would have been severely constrained. But the accelerated production came with costs that became apparent as the war progressed. Some Liberty ships experienced catastrophic structural failures. 3 vessels broke completely in half due to brittle fracture problems, a phenomenon poorly understood in the 1940s, where cracks could propagate rapidly through welded steel under certain temperature conditions. The SS Schenectady split completely in 2 while docked in calm water in January 1943. The hull simply fractured, the crack running the entire length of the ship in seconds. Investigations revealed that the welded construction, combined with specific steel properties at cold temperatures, created vulnerability that riveted construction didn't share. The failures generated renewed criticism of Kaiser's methods. Traditional shipbuilders argued that the emphasis on speed had compromised fundamental structural integrity. Naval architects who had warned against welded construction cited the failures as validation of their concerns. Kaiser responded with characteristic directness. He didn't deny the failures or minimize the problem. Instead, he funded extensive research into the causes and implemented immediate changes. His metallurgists worked with steel producers to modify alloy specifications. His engineers redesigned joints to prevent crack propagation. His inspectors implemented additional quality controls. By 1944, the brittle fracture problem was essentially solved. The improved welding procedures and steel specifications eliminated the issue. But the three ships that broke in half remained powerful symbols for critics who argued that Kaiser's revolution had been built on compromised quality. Yet the overall casualty statistics told a different story. Of 2,710 Liberty ships built, approximately 200 were lost to enemy action, a loss rate of 7.4%. This compared favorably with pre-war merchant shipping loss rates. The vast majority of Kaiser-built vessels survived the war and continued operating for decades afterward. The SS John W. Brown, built in 1942, remains operational as a museum ship in Baltimore over 80 years after construction. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, also built in 1942, still makes occasional voyages under its own power. The longevity of these vessels demonstrated that accelerated construction had not fundamentally compromised structural integrity. Production ceased in September 1945. By December, Kaiser's workforce had fallen from 200,000 to fewer than 20,000. The Richmond shipyards that had employed 100,000 workers at their peak stood largely empty by spring 1946. Vanport City, the Oregon boom town, would be destroyed by flooding in 1948 and never rebuilt. The transformation appeared to evaporate as quickly as it had emerged. The workers dispersed, returning to farms, homes and peacetime employment. The massive shipyards fell silent. The building ways that had launched a ship every few days went months without activity. Yet the knowledge developed during the emergency program did not disappear. The prefabrication techniques, welding procedures and parallel assembly approaches that Kaiser pioneered became standard practice in global shipbuilding. When Japan and South Korea rebuilt their maritime industries in the 1950s and 1960s, they studied Kaiser's Liberty ship program and adopted his approaches as the foundation of their yards. The massive shipbuilding facilities in Ulsan, South Korea and Nagasaki, Japan, that would dominate world shipping construction for decades were direct descendants of Richmond Shipyard's revolutionary practices. Every modern shipyard, whether building container vessels in Korea, oil tankers in Japan, or cruise ships in Europe, uses approaches derived from Kaiser's Liberty ship program. But perhaps the most significant legacy was not technical but social. Kaiser's yards had proven that complex industrial production could be performed by workers who had been systematically excluded from skilled trades. The tens of thousands of women who had welded Liberty ships didn't forget those capabilities when the war ended. Many continued in industrial work. Others applied the confidence and skills they had gained to different pursuits. Margaret Wilson, the former secretary who became a welder, eventually returned to clerical work after the war. But in her letters and later interviews, she spoke of the shipyard experience as transformative. I discovered I could do things I never imagined. That knowledge stayed with me. When I faced challenges later in life, I remembered that I had helped build ships in 4 days. It gave me confidence that I could handle whatever came next. Joseph James, the former sharecropper who became a team leader, used his shipyard wages and experience to start a welding business in Oakland after the war. He employed dozens of workers over 3 decades, many of them minorities who faced barriers in traditional employment. His success, and the success of thousands like him, demonstrated that Kaiser's revolution had opened doors that stayed open. The Richmond shipyards themselves gradually faded from active use. The massive cranes were dismantled. The building ways were abandoned. By the 1970s, much of the facility had been demolished or converted to other purposes. A small museum remains, preserving photographs and artifacts from the extraordinary years when thousands of inexperienced workers built ships at rates that still seem impossible. On the museum wall hangs a photograph from November 1942. It shows the Robert E. Peary sliding into San Francisco Bay, surrounded by workers who built a complete ship in 4 days. The faces in the photograph are diverse. Men and women, young and old, representing dozens of backgrounds and ethnicities. They look tired, proud, certain of what they had accomplished. Henry Kaiser stands among them, not at the front but mixed into the crowd, wearing work clothes rather than a suit. He's looking not at the camera but at the ship, as if still calculating what might be possible next. The photograph captures a moment when industrial capability, human potential, and urgent necessity converged to create something that should have been impossible. The ships Kaiser built won no battles directly. They carried supplies, not weapons. They were utilitarian rather than elegant, mass-produced rather than crafted. But they changed the fundamental mathematics of the war. They proved that conventional wisdom about what industries required could be systematically dismantled and rebuilt. They demonstrated that excluded populations possessed capabilities that society had refused to recognize. The Robert E. Peary sailed for 27 years after its 4-day construction, carrying cargo across every ocean, surviving storms and peacetime service. When it was finally scrapped in 1963, the steel was still sound, the weld still intact. The impossible ship, built by workers who weren't supposed to be capable of building ships, had lasted longer than many vessels built by traditional craftsmen using centuries of accumulated knowledge. That was Henry Kaiser's ultimate contribution, not the ships themselves, but the shattering of assumptions about what was possible and who could achieve it.